The year was 1789, and France trembled under the weight of hunger, debt, and restless ideals. The streets of Paris boiled with anger and talk of liberty and equality, spread like wildfire through pamphlets, taverns, and crowded assemblies. Yet behind the roar of the mob, the royal palace echoed with uncertainty. King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette felt the walls closing in on them as their power was stripped away piece by men who once bowed to them but now shouted for their downfall. The Bastille had fallen, and with it the old order seemed ready to collapse. But history does not always follow the path we know. Sometimes a single night, a single decision can redirect the fate of nations. By the summer of 1791, the king could no longer endure the humiliations forced upon him by the revolutionaries who pretended to offer a constitution while holding a dagger to his throat. Whispers filled the palace halls of a daring escape, a flight not of cowardice but of survival. For beyond Paris, loyal armies and sympathetic nobles still waited for their sovereign to lead them. Plans were laid in secret, not with the clumsy grandeur that doomed him in our timeline, but with precision and care. The royal family would disguise themselves not as lumbering aristocrats in lavish carriages, but as humble travelers in a small and swift coach. The route was planned to avoid suspicion, and loyal allies placed fresh horses at hidden stops. The Swedish noble Axel von Fersen coordinated every detail with devotion, his loyalty burning brighter than fear. On the night of June 20th, the escape began. Paris was hushed in uneasy sleep, while shadows slipped from the palace. Louis dressed as a merchant, Marie as a governess, their children bundled as common youths, and Madame Elizabeth wrapped in plain attire. No trumpets, no servants, no unnecessary display, only silence and determination. The coach rolled quietly into the dark roads beyond the city walls, the air heavy with danger, yet charged with the electricity of destiny. Unlike the doomed historical flight, where hesitation and recognition sealed their fate, this time the king stayed hidden and silent, never stepping out to greet strangers, never allowing his face to betray him. Each checkpoint passed swiftly, as allies ensured they remained unchallenged. For 2 tense days the family raced northward. No feasts, no delays, no curious pauses to observe villages, only relentless movement. Exhaustion gnawed at them, but the fear of capture drove them forward. Children whimpered quietly, yet were comforted by Marie, who whispered promises of safety. Louis clenched his fists within the coach, vowing that once freed he would reclaim his authority and restore the realm. At dawn of June 22nd, the weary travelers reached Montmedy, the fortress stronghold of loyalist troops commanded by General Bouillet. Cheers erupted as the gates opened for their king. Soldiers knelt and swore allegiance, and for the first time in months, Louis stood tall, not as a prisoner of Paris, but as a monarch ready to act. Back in Paris, the news struck like a thunderclap. The assembly awoke to the realization that the king had escaped their grasp. Fury erupted among Jacobins and Girondins alike. Pamphlets screamed of betrayal and treachery. The mob raged in the streets demanding vengeance, but their target was gone, safely shielded by cannons and cavalry. Rumors spread that Austria and Prussia would soon march to defend the royal cause, while peasants in the countryside divided, some clinging to revolutionary dreams, others recalling their faith in king and church. The fragile unity of the revolution cracked like glass under the hammer of reality. Louis wasted no time. Under the banners of the fleur-de-lis, he declared that the revolution was not a noble movement, but a rebellion against God and tradition. He promised reform, yes, but under the crown, not under the mob. Marie Antoinette, once vilified in Paris, now became a symbol of resistance among royalists, depicted in pamphlets as a suffering mother and a new Joan of Arc, her Austrian blood seen as a bridge to powerful allies across Europe. Soldiers kissed the hems of her gown, swearing to fight for her honor, while generals plotted campaigns to reclaim the heart of France. As the summer sun blazed over Europe, the stage was set for a civil war unlike any the continent had seen. One path would lead to the guillotine and terror, the other to the restoration of divine monarchy.
But with the royal family now safe under loyal banners, the revolutionaries faced an enemy emboldened and united. The die had been cast, and France's fate stood at the edge of a sword.
The escape of the royal family shattered the illusion that Paris controlled the destiny of France. Suddenly, the revolutionaries who had spoken so boldly of liberty and equality found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Their king was not a puppet under their constitution, but a sovereign surrounded by loyal armies. Whispers turned into panic, and panic into rage, as mobs stormed the streets, demanding punishment of traitors within the assembly. The National Guard split, as some units swore loyalty to the crown, while others clung to revolutionary ideals. The fragile government trembled on the edge of collapse. Far beyond the capital, royalist banners began to rise. In Brittany, peasants armed with scythes and muskets declared their devotion to king and church. In the Vendée, priests preached fiery sermons calling the revolution a sin against God. Nobles who had fled now returned, emboldened by the king's escape. Castles once abandoned were lit with torches as families prepared to raise regiments in his name. France, which only weeks before seemed united in change, now fractured into rival camps, one waving the tricolor of the revolution and the other the white banner of the Bourbons. Europe too watched with sharpened interest. Austria, under Leopold II, viewed his sister Marie Antoinette not as a doomed queen, but as a beacon of legitimacy. He pledged troops and gold to defend her cause. Prussia, under Frederick William II, saw opportunity to humble the revolutionaries and secure influence in the West. Spain, under Charles IV, declared the rebellion an insult to monarchs everywhere and promised arms for Louis. Even the Pope in Rome thundered from the pulpit that the uprising was heresy and must be crushed. Soon envoys crossed borders, treaties were whispered, and the great monarchies of Europe aligned to restore the throne of France. Among the officers who faced this choice was a young Corsican artilleryman, Napoleon Bonaparte. Restless, ambitious, and disgusted by the chaos in Paris, he looked upon the revolution not as liberation, but as anarchy that devoured itself. In this alternate course, he chose loyalty to order over dreams of republican glory. When news reached him that the king stood safe at Montmedy, Napoleon offered his sword to the crown. His keen eye for strategy impressed General Bouilly, who welcomed him eagerly. The seeds of a royalist champion were planted, seeds that would grow into something Europe had never seen. Within Montmedy, plans for counterattack burned brightly. Louis, no longer a timid monarch forced into signatures and humiliations, now spoke with conviction. He declared that France would be reclaimed not with empty promises, but with faith, steel, and tradition. His words electrified nobles who had doubted him. Marie Antoinette stood at his side, her presence more commanding than ever. Pamphlets spread through loyalist towns depicting her as a suffering mother chosen by heaven. Her image rallied thousands who otherwise would have hesitated. The monarchy was no longer distant and aloof. It was flesh and blood in exile, calling its people to rise. By late summer, columns of royalist troops moved across the countryside. Peasants who despised the heavy taxes of Paris joined them. Deserters from the Revolutionary Army flocked to their banners. Entire villages swore loyalty at the sound of drums. The revolutionary government in Paris found itself encircled by discontent. Their armies weakened by division and desertion, their coffers empty, their allies abroad hesitant. The once triumphant revolution looked fragile, like a candle guttering in the wind. Meanwhile, the coalition armies of Austria and Prussia prepared to march. At Koblenz, immigrant nobles who had fled during the first years of revolt now formed legions eager to return. Their speeches called for vengeance against those who dared touch their estates. Their fervor, mixed with the iron discipline of foreign troops, promised a storm unlike any France had faced. Louis embraced these exiles, not as greedy aristocrats, but as brothers returning to a sacred cause. He knew that without them, his throne could never be restored, but with them, Europe itself might bow once more to Bourbon power. In Paris, the Jacobins and Girondins fought each other more fiercely than they fought their enemies. Robespierre thundered that the king must be executed, even in absentia. The Girondins argued for negotiations to preserve the nation. Factions clashed in the streets, while food shortages sharpened tempers. The revolution, which promised unity, now consumed itself. And in the shadow of this chaos, the sound of marching boots from the east grew louder each day.
As September approached, the two Frances prepared for collision, one born of ancient monarchy and sanctified by faith, the other forged in the fires of revolution and driven by dreams of equality. In this struggle, there could be no compromise. The white flag and the tricolor could not fly together. The stage was set for war. And from this crucible of conflict, heroes and villains would emerge, reshaping the destiny not only of France, but of all Europe.
The armies of Europe advanced with thunder in their steps, and the banners of monarchy shining in the sunlight. From the east came Austrian and Prussian legions, hardened by years of discipline. From the south, Spanish columns crossed the Pyrenees, bringing seasoned veterans. From within France, royalist forces under General Billet gathered peasants, nobles, and deserters into a swelling tide. And in their midst, young Napoleon Bonaparte placed his cannons with ruthless precision. The coalition moved not as scattered hosts, but as a storm converging upon the heart of France. Paris braced itself with desperation. The National Assembly raised militias of half-trained men. Jacobins demanded harsher measures and called the populace to arms. Speeches filled with fury echoed in the clubs and taverns. Yet behind the rhetoric stood hunger and exhaustion. Food grew scarce, coin worthless, and faith in the revolution cracked. Entire regiments deserted at the first sight of royalist banners. Generals quarreled and distrusted each other. The government clung to survival by sheer will. But the shadow of fear lengthened with every courier reporting fresh defeats in the provinces. The first great clash came near Rheims, where General Kellerman led a Republican force of 30,000 against Bouillet and his allies. The fields became a storm of musket smoke and cannon thunder. Peasants fought alongside nobles under the white banner, while on the other side, ragged revolutionaries fought for ideals that already wavered. Napoleon directed the artillery with relentless calm. His guns tore through Republican lines until chaos spread. At dusk, the revolutionaries broke, leaving the countryside open to the advancing royalists. Rheims fell swiftly, and a victory rang across Europe as proof that the crown was not only restored, but triumphant. From the east, the Prussians under Friedrich William pressed forward, linking with Austrian divisions led by Archduke Charles. Together, they carved through resistance near Metz and Nancy. Villages once shouting for liberty now opened their gates in relief to disciplined monarchist troops who promised order and bread. From the south, Spanish veterans defeated hastily gathered Republican militias at Bayonne and pushed into Aquitaine, while the Vendée rose in open revolt under priests who blessed swords before battle. France bled from every direction, and the tricolor grew tattered in the wind. By the time October arrived, Paris stood nearly encircled. Lafayette attempted to rally defense, but his men melted away. Discipline collapsed, and Napoleon's guns began to shell the outskirts with cold efficiency. The siege of Paris became a nightmare. Food ran out. Mobs turned on each other. Factions of Jacobins and Girondins accused one another of treason. Executions in the squares did nothing to restore order. Instead, fear drove thousands to desertion. Rumors swirled that the king himself would soon march into the city. The very thought shattered morale among the defenders. On the 15th day of bombardment, the Royalist coalition stormed the northern gates. Prussian infantry poured in, followed by Austrian cavalry, while French loyalists seized the bridges. Chaos swallowed the streets as terrified citizens fled and resistance crumbled. Napoleon directed batteries to silence the last Republican cannons, and with thunderous roars, the defenders collapsed. Paris descended into blood and fire. Tens of thousands perished, soldiers and civilians alike. Mercy was scarce for the capital that had birthed rebellion. The victors allowed fury to sweep through alleys and squares, a grim reckoning for years of insult and violence. Within days, the tricolor no longer flew. The fleur-de-lis, once thought consigned to history, fluttered over the city once more.
Louis entered Paris not as a prisoner dragged by mobs, but as a sovereign restored by armies. Crowds, fearful yet awed, knelt in the streets. Church bells rang out, not in defiance, but in solemn praise. Marie Antoinette stood beside him, her head unbowed, hailed by royalist soldiers as a new saint of France. Pamphlets already spread depicting her as the guardian of monarchy, chosen by divine providence. The city that had cursed her name now trembled at her return. The remnants of the revolution fled south and west, gathering in Lyon and scattered strongholds. Robespierre raged against fate, declaring the fight not finished. Yet his words echoed hollow as his followers deserted. Lyon became the last desperate bastion. Barricades raised, fiery speeches shouted from balconies, but the royalists advanced methodically. Napoleon once more placed his cannons upon the heights, and for 3 relentless weeks his shells pounded the defenses until the city lay broken. Lyon fell, its leaders captured, its defenders scattered, and the revolution's flame was extinguished. From that moment, the fate of France was sealed. The dream of liberty, equality, and fraternity lay drowned in blood and smoke. The monarchy, not only restored, but empowered by victory, stood ready to reshape the nation with iron resolve. Europe exhaled in satisfaction. The tide of revolution that threatened all thrones had been stemmed in France itself. But beneath the triumph stirred a new power. For Napoleon's star had risen in service of the crown, and his brilliance in war would soon carry him beyond the role of mere artillery officer, into the heart of the restored Bourbon order.
The fall of Lyon marked the death of the revolution and the rebirth of the monarchy. Louis returned to Versailles not as a weakened king under a constitution, but as an absolute sovereign clothed in divine authority. The Estates General was dissolved, the tricolor outlawed, and the cry of liberty, equality, fraternity silenced. In its place, the crown raised the motto of faith, loyalty, and obedience. Priests who had hidden during the terror emerged once more, and churches long desecrated were cleansed with holy rites. The Pope himself sent blessings, declaring the kingdom purified by fire and restored to God. Punishment followed swiftly. Tribunals hunted those who had stirred rebellion. Jacobin leaders dragged before the guillotine they once wielded, their heads falling to cheers of royalist crowds. Robespierre, Danton, Marat, and others whose names once echoed with revolutionary fervor now served as grim warnings carved into memory. Nobles who had betrayed the crown were stripped of titles and lands, entire bloodlines erased to make room for loyalists who had fought for king and altar. Yet Louis tempered vengeance with pragmatism. Lesser supporters of the revolution were offered forgiveness if they swore oaths to the monarchy, thus weaving fragments of the fractured nation back under his authority. Marie Antoinette, whose image had been blackened by lies and slanders, now rose as a symbol of sanctity. Her survival through hatred and exile transformed her into a living saint in the eyes of royalists. Pamphlets depicted her as a new Joan of Arc. Mothers named their daughters after her. Soldiers carried her portrait into battle. Her Austrian heritage, once a curse, now became a bridge to powerful allies. Austria, Spain, and the Papal States saw her not as a foreign queen, but as the chosen guardian of monarchy itself. Her presence beside Louis gave the restored order a mystique that transcended politics. Napoleon Bonaparte, the young Corsican who had directed artillery with brilliance at Reims, Paris, and Lyon, was elevated by Louis to Marshal of France. At only 23, his name spread as the sword of monarchy. Unlike the old nobility who claimed privilege by birth, Napoleon represented service, rewarded by merit. He was granted lands, titles, and a marriage into a cadet branch of the Bourbons. His loyalty bound not only by honor, but by blood.
In him, the monarchy found both a savior and a future champion, a man destined to reshape Europe, not as an emperor of revolution, but as the hammer of kings. Reforms followed swiftly. Louis learned from the chaos that had nearly destroyed his kingdom. He introduced a universal land tax shared by all estates to stabilize finances, abolished internal tariffs to encourage trade, and created provincial assemblies to manage local governance under crown oversight. The Bank of France was founded, modeled on English stability. Loans from Spain and Austria provided immediate relief, while plans for conquest promised new wealth. Peasants in royalist regions were rewarded with tax breaks and church-run charities, their loyalty secured. Nobles who had fought for the king were ennobled further, creating a new aristocracy based not only on blood, but on service. The monarchy emerged stronger than before, its foundations rebuilt upon loyalty, faith, and pragmatic reform. Yet peace was brief. Across the Atlantic colonies stirred with rebellion, inspired by the failed French Revolution and by whispers of liberty. But now, with France and Spain aligned under Bourbon's solidarity, revolt was crushed with ruthless efficiency. Armies sailed to the Caribbean and Spanish America, stamping out uprisings before they spread. The Haitian revolt never reached success. Plantations remained intact under heavy garrisons. Colonial wealth poured into royal coffers. New Orleans, Havana, Cartagena, and Veracruz became fortified bastions of Bourbon power. Revolutionary pamphlets were burned in taverns, priests thundered against heresy, and loyalty to crown and altar stamped itself upon the New World. In Europe, the great monarchies embraced the restored France as a partner, not a threat. Austria gained influence in Italy, Prussia secured concessions in the Rhineland, Spain held sway over the Mediterranean. Yet beneath this alliance stirred ambition. Louis and his ministers knew that to secure France's place, they needed more than survival. They needed dominance. Napoleon himself urged campaigns into the Rhineland and Italy, promising that war would not only repay debts, but elevate France to supremacy once more. His vision was clear. France had been humbled by rebellion, but could rise greater through conquest, under monarchy, not revolution. In 1803, war erupted. As France and Austria moved into Silesia against Prussia, Russia joined, promising lands in Poland. Spain attacked British holdings in the Caribbean. The Bourbon coalition unleashed its might. Napoleon, leading armies under the white flag of the monarchy, proved unstoppable. His strategies blending lightning speed with ruthless precision. Prussian armies broke, British fleets bled in distant seas, colonies shifted hands. Europe trembled as the House of Bourbon surged back to preeminence, not as fractured rivals, but as united monarchs wielding faith and steel. By 1807, Britain, exhausted, accepted defeat. The West Indies divided between France and Spain. Austria expanded. Russia gained Polish territories, and France secured its dominance of the continent. The revolutionary spirit that once threatened every throne was buried beneath waves of Bourbon banners. Louis hailed as the savior of monarchy, Marie revered as a living saint, Napoleon celebrated as the hammer of kings. The world entered a new age where the cries of revolution were drowned by church bells and marching drums.